During the late Victorian era, Whitechapel held a notorious reputation as London's most infamous criminal enclave. The area was plagued by a host of social issues, including extreme poverty, substandard housing, poor sanitation, homelessness, rampant alcohol dependency, and a pervasive presence of prostitution. Adding to the bleakness were the 233 common lodging houses scattered throughout Whitechapel, accommodating approximately 8,500 individuals each night. These common lodging houses served as cheap communal lodgings for the desperate, destitute, and transient individuals who also included the unfortunate victims of the Whitechapel murders. Notably, all the identified victims of the Whitechapel murders lived within the heart of the impoverished area. During this period, police work and criminal prosecutions relied heavily on confessions, witness testimonies, and catching the perpetrator red-handed. Advanced forensic techniques, such as fingerprint analysis or blood typing, were non-existent at the time. Between 1888 and 1891, 11 deaths occurring in or near Whitechapel were compiled into a police docket, referred to as the Whitechapel murders. Unfortunately, much of the original evidence and documentations have either been stolen, lost, or destroyed over time. In the early hours of Tuesday, August 7th, just after a Monday bank holiday, a tragic incident occurred when Martha Tabram, a prostitute, was brutally murdered at approximately 2:30 a.m. Her lifeless body was discovered at George Yard Buildings in Whitechapel shortly before 5 a.m. The gruesome crime involved 39 stab wounds inflicted to her neck, torso, and genitals using a short blade. Interestingly, all but one of the wounds appeared to have been inflicted by a right-handed assailant. In response to statements from a fellow prostitute and PC Thomas Barrett, who was patrolling in the vicinity, Inspector Reed organized an identification parade at the Tower of London and Wellington barracks with soldiers. But unfortunately, they did not yield any positive results in identifying the culprit. It's worth noting that many experts do not consider Tabram's murder as part of the series attributed to the Ripper. The primary reason for this is the nature of the wounds she sustained, which involved repeated stabbings, while later victims of the Ripper typically suffered slash wounds and abdominal mutilations. Nonetheless, despite the differences, the possibility of a connection between Tabram's murder and the Ripper killings cannot be entirely ruled out. On Friday, August 31st, tragedy struck as Mary Ann Nichols was brutally murdered in a back street of Whitechapel, known then as Bucks Row. Cart driver Charles Cross made a grim discovery at 3:45 a.m., finding her lifeless body on the ground in front of a gated stable entrance. The scene was gruesome. Her throat had been slashed twice from left to right, and her abdomen bore a deep, jagged wound with several shallow incisions across it, all inflicted by a violent downward motion with the same knife. Initially, local detectives from the Metropolitan Police took charge of the investigation, as the murder fell within their jurisdiction. On the same day, James Monroe resigned as head of the Criminal Investigation Department due to disagreements with Chief Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren. Despite efforts, the initial investigation into the murder yielded little success. However, some elements of the press linked the killings of the two previous murders, suggesting a possible gang involvement. The Star newspaper speculated that a single killer might be responsible, and the other newspapers adopted this narrative. The growing suspicions of a serial killer roaming London prompted the secondment of Detective Inspectors Frederick Alberline, Henry Moore, and Walter Andrews from the Central Office at Scotland Yard. Based on available evidence, Coroner Baxter concluded that Nichols was murdered just after 3 a.m., at the location where her body was found. In his summation, he dismissed the possibility of her murder being connected to the case of Tabram, citing the differences in the lethal weapons used, as neither of the earlier cases involved a throat slash. However, as the inquest into Nichols' death concluded, another woman had already been murdered, leading Baxter to observe that the mounting similarities between the murders raised further concerns about a potential serial killer on the loose. The lifeless body of Annie Chapman was discovered at approximately 6 a.m. on Saturday, September 8th, near a doorway in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Prior to her murder, Chapman had left her lodgings at 2 a.m. with the intent of obtaining money from a client to pay her rent. The gruesome scene revealed the brutality of the act. Chapman's throat had been slashed from left to right, and she had been disemboweled. Her intestines were thrown out of her abdomen over each shoulder, and part of her uterus was missing. The pathologist, George Baxter Phillips, believed that the murderer must have had anatomical knowledge to have extracted the reproductive organs so precisely with a blade about 6 to 8 inches in length. However, other experts dismissed the notion that the killer possessed surgical skills. There were varying theories about the removal of organs from the bodies. Some suggested that mortuary staff might have taken advantage of already opened bodies to extract and sell organs as surgical specimens. Meanwhile, on September 10th, the police arrested a local man known as John Pfizer, also known as Leather Apron, who had a reputation for terrorizing local prostitutes. However, his alibis for the recent murders were corroborated, and he was released without charges. At the inquest, a witness named Miss Elizabeth Long testified that she had seen Chapman speaking with a man at approximately 5:30 a.m. near the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, where Chapman's body was later found. The man was believed to be the murderer, described as over 40, slightly taller than Chapman, with a dark complexion and a foreign appearance, dressed in shabby genteel attire, wearing a brown deerstalker hat and a dark overcoat. Another witness, Carpenter Albert Kadosh, reported hearing voices in the neighboring yard at 29 Hanbury Street, followed by the sound of something or someone falling against the fence. The series of murders caused widespread panic in London, with a mob attacking the Commercial Road police station, suspecting that the murderer was being held there. The killings also led to anti-Semitic demonstrations fueled by rumors of Jewish ritual killings, prompting the Member of Parliament for Whitechapel, Samuel Montague, to offer a reward for the killer's capture. Local residents established the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee to aid in the investigation, as the Metropolitan Police refused to offer a reward due to concerns about false or misleading information. The investigation faced some challenges in its early stages, with changes in leadership and direction. Robert Anderson, who had been appointed head of the CID, went on sick leave, and Superintendent Thomas Arnold was also on leave, leaving the direction of the inquiries in disarray. The Chief Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, appointed Chief Inspector Donald Swanson to coordinate the investigation from Scotland Yard. During the course of the investigation, a German hairdresser named Charles Ludwig was taken into custody on suspicion of the murders, but was later released when the subsequent double murder proved that the true culprit was still at large. On Sunday, September 30th, the body of prostitute Elizabeth Stride was found at around 1 a.m. in Dutsfield Yard in Whitechapel. Stride's throat had been cut from left to right, and she had been killed just moments before her body was discovered. Remarkably, her body showed no signs of mutilation, leading some to speculate that the killer might have been interrupted by someone entering the yard, possibly Louis Diemschutz, who stumbled upon the crime scene. Despite differing opinions, some commentators believe that Stride's murder was unrelated to the other killings due to the absence of mutilation, the location of the murder south of Whitechapel Road, and the potential use of a shorter, different blade. However, most experts find distinct similarities between Stride's murders and at least 2 of the earlier ones, including the murder of Catherine Eddowes on the same night. At approximately 1:45 a.m., Catherine Eddowes' body, gruesomely mutilated, was discovered by P.C. Edward Watkins. Her throat had been slashed from left to right with a sharp knife at least 6 inches long. Her face and abdomen were savagely mutilated, and her intestines were drawn out over her right shoulder. Part of her left kidney and most of her uterus had been removed. Pathologists differed in their views of the murderer's anatomical knowledge, with some believing the killer had considerable expertise, while others disputed this notion. At 3 a.m., a fragment of Eddowes' blood-stained apron was discovered in a passage at 108 Golston Street in Whitechapel, about a third of a mile away from the murder scene. Nearby, chalk writing on the wall included the controversial phrase, either reading, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," or, "The Jews are not the men who will be blamed for nothing." Commissioner Warren ordered the words to be erased at 5 a.m., fearing that they could spark anti-Semitic unrest. The coroner, Wynne Baxter, believed that Stride had been attacked suddenly, as she was found holding a packet of breath-freshening sweets in her left hand, indicating she had no time to defend herself. A grocer, Matthew Packer, implied that he had seen Stride with the murderer, but this account conflicted with statements by other witnesses who had seen her with a man shortly before her murder. Despite ongoing investigations, little progress was made, leading to criticism of the Metropolitan Police and the Home Secretary, Henry Matthews. A reward was offered for information leading to the capture of the killer, and the idea of using bloodhounds to track the culprit was considered, but eventually abandoned due to practical concerns. The case took an eerie turn when on September 27th, the Central News Agency received a letter, allegedly from the killer, signed Jack the Ripper, claiming responsibility for the murders. On October 1st, a postcard also signed Jack the Ripper arrived at the agency, describing the murders of Stride and Eddowes as the double event. Subsequently, an unidentified female torso was found in the basement of New Scotland Yard on October 2nd, though its connection to the Whitechapel murders is considered unlikely. During the investigation, psychic Robert James Lee offered his assistance, but the police rejected his offer. The head of CID, Anderson, returned from leave on October 6 to take charge of the investigation at Scotland Yard. Later in October, George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee received another letter claiming to be from the killer, accompanied by half a human kidney preserved in alcohol, allegedly taken from Eddowes' body. By the end of October, the police had interviewed over 2,000 people, investigated more than 300 leads, and detained 80 individuals. On Friday, November 9th, tragedy struck once more as prostitute Mary Jane Kelly was brutally murdered in her single room at 13 Miller's Court, located behind 26 Dorset Street, Spitalfields. Notably, one of the earlier victims, Chapman, had also lived in Dorset Street, and Eddowes was known to have slept rough there on occasion. Kelly's body was discovered shortly after 10:45 a.m., lying on the bed in a severely mutilated state. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the first doctor at the scene, believed that Kelly was killed by a slash to the throat. However, the extent of the atrocities surpassed anything seen before, with her abdomen cavity sliced open, her viscera removed and scattered around the room. Her breasts were severed, her face beyond recognition due to mutilation, and her thighs partially cut through to the bone, with some muscles missing. In a striking contrast to the other victims, she was undressed, wearing only a light chemise, while her neatly folded clothes were found in a chair, except for some burnt in the fireplace. It is suggested that the clothes were burned by the murderer for light, as the room was dimly lit with a single candle. The gruesome murder was likely the most brutal because the killer had more time to commit his heinous act in the privacy of a closed room, rather than on the streets. The inquest into Kelly's death was presided over by Dr. Roderick MacDonald, the coroner of Northeast Middlesex, held at Shoreditch Town Hall on November 12th. The funeral took place on November 19th, attended by an enormous crowd of mourners, resulting in gridlocked streets as the cortege made its way from Shoreditch Mortuary to the Roman Catholic Cemetery at Laystone, where she was laid to rest. In the wake of these chilling murders, Charles Warren resigned as Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police on November 8th after being informed that he could not make public statements without Home Office approval. James Monroe, who had resigned earlier due to differences with Warren, replaced him in December. On November 10th, the police surgeon, Thomas Bond, wrote to Robert Anderson, head of the London CID, highlighting the striking similarities between the 5 murders of Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, and Kelly, including that they were no doubt committed by the same hand. The cabinet decided to offer a pardon to any accomplice who came forward with information leading to the conviction of the actual murderer. Despite deploying 143 plainclothes policemen in Whitechapel in November and December, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner reported that the Whitechapel murderer remained unidentified. The city was gripped with fear and uncertainty as the perpetrator continued to evade capture. The identity of the murderer or murderers behind the Whitechapel murders remains a haunting mystery, and the cases have never been solved.